Hello everyone. In today's video we're going to be taking a look at the RNAV approach. So the RNAV approach is a little different than what you've probably seen with other approaches because we're going to be using the GPS literally to get us all the way down to the ground. So let's go ahead and take a look at an example of one of these approaches. So today what we're going to be doing is taking over from Westover Air Force Base, which is up here, and we're going to use the GPS to direct us directly to our initial approach fix, Kibby. Now the interesting thing here is when you do GPS approaches or RNAV approaches, don't be surprised if there's more than one of these IFs. You might have one over here or one over here. It simply means when you go to dial them into your GPS, just make sure you pick the right one for what you're approaching. Once we hit Kibby, we're basically going to flip on the approach autopilot, which is then going to fly us both horizontally all the way down to the ground, as well as vertically all the way down onto the ground. Things we need to watch out for is things like if we approach from this direction, we're going to have no procedure turns, no course reversal, which makes our life much, much simpler. We also notice that we need to be between 7,000 and 3,000 feet when you cross Kibby. And of course, as you come down, we're going to be crossing our final approach fix, which is this little X right here at 2,100, and it's going to take us all the way down to the ground. Now, if you take a look at our minimums, they're a little different this time. You'll know there's an LPV, an LNAV VNAV, and an LNAV MDA. This simply says that if we choose to use a GPS, which also is basically certified for LPV, it gives us a 370-foot minimum, which is actually pretty impressive. If we're using an LNAV VNAV style, which is the barometric one that it talks about up top, we get a 560-foot because it's not as precise. And then finally, if we don't even use the vertical navigation feature of our GPS, we get a 560 feet as well altitude up and down. And naturally, if we want to do circling, which I've showed you with the ADF stuff, we want to be very cautious. We get an even higher altitude. Now, one of the reasons we have such a high minimum here is because the fact the airports are gigantic. It's very easy to find. And again, there's not a lot of scary mountains. Visibility-wise, we need 1/2 of a mile visibility, which is not much, but we'll make the best of it. Let's go scoot over to the simulator real quick and figure out exactly what this is going to look like for us. So here we are, we're sitting here. This is again Westover Air Force Base. Give everybody a wiggle. I've got my G1000 pre-programmed here. I've already built my flight plan. Normally what you do is you click on the proc button, you'd hit select approach with the enter key, and you simply pick the one that you want. In this case, if I wanted RNAV Y or Z, I could just come down here, pick the one that I want. In this case, we're looking for RNAV Y. We'll press that one right there. We could even come down here and change that transition, which is just a fancy term for that initial approach fix. In this case, I'm perfectly fine with that. We could also come down here, of course, and we could even tell it to load it or activate it so we have it later on. But everything's already been pre-activated for us, so I actually don't need to do any of this. So I'm actually going to exit that page now. Now, there's no timing involved because this is a precision up and down approach, but we still have minimums to worry about. So I'm going to go to timer and reference. I'm going to click here, go all the way down to minimums. Since we have a nice, super high quality flight simulator grade GPS, we're going to be using the absolute minimum, which is going to be 370 feet. 370 is right there. Enter. All set. That's all we need to do. Now we literally just go. That's kind of nice, right? We're going to go ahead and set our altitude as well. Today we're going to be traveling at 2,000 feet as initial, and then we're going to be dropping down once we get a little bit closer. You'll notice even though we're on the ground, we're already being provided with vertical information for this approach. That's amazing. This is one of the few times you actually can use the G1000 properly in this thing. All right, let's roll. So we're going to be taking off using a conventional approach. And we're just going to be flying directly right over to Kibby, crossing Kibby, and basically pressing the approach button until you feel the thump of you hitting the ground. There's really not a lot to it. One of the greatest things, by the way, about a GPS approach is the fact that it can be used for airports that didn't even have traditional approaches like VOR or ILS or anything like that. And you've also got this other type of approach, which you've probably heard of, called an MLS or a WAS approach, which allows you to take a GPS approach and make it even more accurate. You're basically using local radio signal stations, which is just amazing if you think about it. Again, in a few years, GPS is pretty much going to be the only type of approach that you're ever going to have to fly. I'm going to pull myself up. The weather is not very pleasant today, but I don't have to worry about that too much. But again, this is just following the magenta line kind of flying. And I don't know, it's not very exciting in my book, but it's worth noting because it's so universal. Let's go ahead and flip over here. I'm going to press the approach button. I'm going to go over to the autopilot button, flight director button. And I'm not going to touch any of the nav buttons or anything like that until we get a little bit closer. I'll turn on flight director though, why not, right? All right, going up. And like I was saying, it's relatively relaxed. At any point, they could call us and tell us to use a different one. We just press the PROC button and dial it in. It's worth noting, by the way, with random navigation approaches, that you can use a GPS to basically fake fly, if you want to think about it another way, any other type of approach. You know, if I wanted to do an ADF approach, for example, and I didn't have an ADF on board, I could basically tell my GPS to pretend fly it. And you could use it as a coupling. But you have to be really cautious because not every installation of a autopilot is going to have that same rating. So you want to kind of be cautious about that. Going to be about 100 knots is going to be quick enough to climb. They had a patch that came out on Thursday, which has been kind of an interesting experience. So my frame rates are better than they've ever been, but the autopilot still needs a little bit of work here. All right. Ooh, geez, look at that fog. It's not really fog. I'm literally inside of a cloud. Fortunately for me, it's not cold enough for icing, or this could end really poorly for us. All right, going to go ahead and level off a little bit here. All right, not a bad idea to shut off the landing light because it's positively blinding. There we go. All right, looking pretty good. So much for 100 knots climbing speed, but that's all right. Now, the interesting thing is, if they asked us to fly a hold, we could actually, in the real G1000, view the hold, and you could actually fly it using the GPS, which is excessive. It's just incredible. It'll also fly things like procedure turns for you, which I think is even better. All right, we are now at our altitude. Delightful. Now, one thing that's probably making a few of you nervous is the fact that if you look over here, you'll notice the fact that we're very high, which actually makes a lot of sense. Go ahead and reduce my power just a teeny tiny bit there. Drop us down to 2,500 RPM, which is kind of the standard 25 and 25. Perfect. Watch it go to 2490. Don't you dare. Don't. Okay, close enough. Good enough for government work. All right, so now we're on approach. Let's go ahead and see where we are on our little chart here. So we've actually taken off. We're about to hit Kibby in just a moment. I can see that I'm not very far away from that at all. We're going to cross Kibby, fly down to Motel at 2,100 feet, and basically guide this thing all the way down to the ground, only using the GPS. All right, looks pretty good. I'm actually going to take advantage of the fact that I can finally use this thing. There's Motel straight ahead. Remember, Motel, we're supposed to be at 2,100 feet, though. So I'm actually going to decrease my altitude a little bit because I think we're a bit too high. Vertical speed mode, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Reduce my power. Obviously, you don't want to go ripping down at maximum speed here. So for whatever reason, they decide to cut Kibby out. That could just be a limitation of the navigation data that Microsoft has access to, or is willing to give us access to, but that's okay. Start slowing down a little bit. Actually, we're going to come down a lot more aggressively than that. You won't have to because you'll already have been at the correct altitude, especially if you've been following the instructions of air traffic control this whole time, which I have been ignoring. All right, remember when we cross that point, we're going to be at 2,100 feet. The good news is this diamond is actually completely accurate to what we're doing today. So if this diamond were actually centered, that means we're actually at the correct altitude. Wouldn't this thing have been nice in some of those other approaches? Man, I'd love that. Reduce my power a little bit. We're getting a little too fast here. And that looks pretty good right there. Nice. Level off. We're still quite high. Motel, we're supposed to be at 2,100 feet. We're at 2,100 feet, and it's still registering us as being pretty high. That's interesting. We can, of course, fly this manually as well, in which case it becomes that LNAV, VNAV approach as opposed to an LPV. But again, it doesn't bother me at all. There we go. Now we're turning onto final. I guess I can flick my landing light back on. Start planning for a landing here. Yeah, we're still way too high, so I think this is a classic case of having the wrong navigation data, but that's okay. We can still fly it manually, doesn't matter. We need about 500 feet per minute. Looks pretty good so far. Again, the GPS is doing all the work here. Now, the interesting thing is normally at any point after we've crossed our final approach, we could actually turn the approach hold on if we wanted. But again, it's not going to do much for us on account of the fact that we're way too high based on what that says. Bring our nose down just a little bit more aggressively here. There we go. So now basically we're flying this manually, which is okay. All right. Looks pretty good. Looks pretty good. Stick my head up a little bit. I can already see the dots, so I know that I'm pretty good, but that's fine. Again, we're flying a manual version of this, at least vertically. So actually, technically, our minimums would have to drop down to 560 feet, but like I said, I think we'll be okay here. And there is the runway. So normally at any point we could go take over control of the aircraft and go ahead and finish flying this the rest of the way ourselves. But in this case, like I said, we're not getting the best data there, so we're kind of having to fly it by hand. If anything, I notice I'm actually drifting too quickly downwards, so bring the nose back up. Bring a little bit of power. And this is the advantage of making sure you don't exceed that minimum before you get too close to the ground. Oh, I think I actually know where that burn is. Okay, yeah, there it goes. There it goes. You can see we're actually starting to catch up to it, even though if you actually had followed it so far, we would have smacked down into the ground. Normally, you're not going to have as much trouble with this. It would be a little bit better aligned. But again, it's all in whatever their navigation data is at that particular place. Just kind of be savvy, that's all. All right, kind of cruising a little bit here. But again, this is all GPS driven. I didn't have to dial any special frequencies for any of this. I could just basically fly it on my own. All right, let's go ahead and do Gumpels. This time I'm going to try really hard not to shut the engine off. Hey, we did it. Gas, undercarriage, mixture, propeller, flaps, light, speed. Everything's set. Oh, now it's giving us the correct vertical information. Sigh. But it's important you as a pilot are quick enough to catch these things and know something doesn't look right before you get a really, really nasty surprise. Turns out in the patch notes, they reversed this for some reason. But again, we're still able to fly it. You're still able to concept it. You know, concepting has just become a verb. All right, reduce speed just a little bit here. Need about 75 knots. Again, at any point I could take over, but I'm going to let the GPS get us a little bit closer. Ah, it finally captured the glide slope. Yeah, I could have done that a long time ago, GPS. So again, be wary of technology. So hopefully this is helpful as far as how this goes. Like I said, normally when you do this, this is a little bit better behaved. Normally this would have been there right when we crossed motel. But apparently it's just maybe my GPS is out of alignment or something like that. You know, I needed to get some maintenance on this plane. I've been putting a lot of hours on it recently. Maybe I need to double check that receiver. But at the same time as we're still able to get all the way down to the ground, we actually just crossed our about 100 feet above our minimums. So if you want to think about how dangerous this would have been normally, this is literally how low and close we would have been before we'd have to make a decision whether or not we should land the aircraft here. Pretty scary, huh? So I always flip off the automatic pilot. Pro tip, by the way, when you transition over to big scary airliners and stuff like that, I really, really recommend, at the moment you see the runway, take manual control of the airplane. It's going to be a lot less bumpy for your passengers. There we go. Now notice my GPS approach, I'm right on glide slope here, is going to literally smack me right into the ground, a little short of where it normally would be if you were flying the ILS approach version of this, which is kind of interesting. All right. Nose up, and we are down. Delightful. Cool. Now, the interesting thing is, and one thing that I've neglected here as I was battling to figure this part out, is if we did run into a situation where we had to fly this as a missed approach, what we would have to have done is actually armed the new altitude after we captured the glide slope. Otherwise, your automatic pilot would actually chase your new altitude down and really, really goof you up. One of the nice things is, in this particular aircraft, at least in the real one, what you could do is you could actually press proc and you could click on activate missed approach. Or if you're really a pro, there's actually this go around button on the side of the throttle that you would press that would instantaneously arm all the details for the missed approach directly inside the G1000, so you could then go ahead and fly it almost immediately. All right, hopefully this has been helpful. Sorry about that little trouble with the up and down there as far as the glide slope goes, but the concept is basically exactly the same regardless of the approach. Just make sure your initial approach fix is the one that you meant to select and not the one 25 miles away. And if there is a procedure turn involved, usually the system is good enough to fly the procedure turn. Enjoy.